Yeah.
Yeah.
He's here. Now we can begin.
So she took it.
I'm Gracia Pellicati. I'm with the Marblehead League of Women Voters, co-sponsor of tonight's presentation, along with Marblehead Racial Justice, Marblehead Museum, and of course, Abbott Public Library. Some of you were probably here last month when Lauren gave a presentation on the Jeremiah Lee slave kitchen and the coastal economy. But tonight, it's more specifically about the brick kitchen. And I'm going to hand over, you all know Lauren, but she's been with museum executive director since 2018. And we want her to speak tonight a little bit about the grant situation in this environment. All right, here's Lauren.
All right, thank you all.
So if I speak from here, can you all hear me okay? Because unfortunately the mic's not working, so thank you. Okay, awesome. So thank you. I see a lot of faces I saw last month. I appreciate you coming back. This time, as Gracia said, we're much more focused on the building itself, the history of the 157 Washington Street, which in Lee's time was the brick kitchen, coach house and slave quarters, and has become many other things over the years. So a sort of a timeline of how it's changed, which not to give anything away, but it's changed quite a bit since Lee built it, but also, you know, what was going on there and why it was important to the town, not just because it was part of the original Lee Mansion estate, but in and of itself and for what was happening there on site. And so I also have to sort of beg your forgiveness if we get, I'm also running the Zoom, so if somebody comes in the waiting room, you might hear a ding and I might need to let them in and you'll see it all happening on screen, so apologies. But all right, let's get started. We can get started. There we go. So just a real quick background, although I think everybody in here knows this already, but the Marblehead Museum was founded in 1898 as the Marblehead Historical Society. Many of you still know it as such. And we're here to preserve, protect, and promote Marblehead's past as a means of enriching the present. And we do that in various ways. We have over 60,000 archival pieces, photographs, 3D objects. We have a number of buildings in town, which I'll review. And of course, we are a private nonprofit, so we're not part of the town. We rely solely on membership dues and donations. And currently we have 2 staff that are full-time, myself and Jarrett Zeman, who many of you know, and 4 part-time staff. And we are very reliant and grateful to everybody who volunteers in all the many ways that people do that for us. So we have the J.O.J. Frost Center, and downstairs from that on Washington Street is where we have our changing exhibit gallery. Of course, the Grand Army of the Republic and Civil War Museum, which is the 2nd floor of the old townhouse. That we'd be happy to show you. You just need to make an appointment and we'll bring you over there. It's a really great spot if you've never been in. It's very much a time capsule. And of course, what we're here to talk about today, which is Jeremiah Lee Mansion Gardens. And now we own the brick building slave quarters next to it as well, which you can see covered in ivy on the picture on the left with the Lee Mansion. It's the building you can barely make out, but that's one of the best drone views I have. And what was so amazing about getting that building is that it really brought together, again, reconstituted, if you will, Lee's original estate. We now own, again, all of the property he owned and then some. Like the lower garden was never his, but we own that as well. But it was just great to be able to bring that all back together and try to start to tell a really cohesive story about everything that happened on the property. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that Jeremiah Lee Mansion has opened for tours again as of June 1st. So please stop in if you've never taken a tour. It's a pretty amazing building. And we're open 5 days a week, Tuesday through Saturday. Now, we've owned the mansion since 1909. And in fact, just a few months after they purchased the building in 1909, they started giving tours. So that's how long tours have been offered at the Lee Mansion. And we always, as an institution, knew that Lee had owned the brick building that you see next to the mansion in this photo here. And over the years, we had tried, the museum, the Historical Society, had tried working with the owners to see if we could come up with some way of obtaining the building or waiting until they were ready to dispose of the property out of the family. But it really wasn't until the last proprietor that some of you may have known, Ray Orn, who was the proprietor of Litchman Orn Print Shop. When he passed away and the family decided it was time, that they didn't want to maintain the building anymore. And I will give them so much credit because they basically gave us right of first refusal. And they brought it to us saying, hey, we're not going to put this on the market yet. We want you to think about whether you want it or not. And that was really generous of them to do that because I'm sure they would have sold it right away, just going straight onto the market. And perhaps in a way that we as a museum could never have competed for. And so thank you to them always for that generosity. But also, of course, to Stanley Goodwin, who literally stepped forward one day and said, you want this building, I think it's important that we have this building and I'm gonna make it happen for you. And so as a result of that amazingly generous donation from him, we own it outright with no debt. Yeah. Yeah, it like leaves you speechless to think about. So, okay, so we have this new building. We know it has a history. It's related to Lee in some way. It's had 250 plus years of history, but how do we walk into a building and figure out how it's changed over time, how it was used, why it was important in all the various ways to the town, to the community? And one of the first things we did is we hired an architectural historian, because though we at the museum are historians, an architectural historian is a very specific skill set and background. And the gentleman down to the left, Myron, whose back is turned to you in the picture, who was scoping through a wall, he is the architectural historian that worked with us. It took him over 2 years to strip away, almost like an onion layer, layers of onion, to strip away the 21st century, the 20th century, the 19th century, meanwhile documenting it all through photography, through architectural plans he drew up, et cetera. So he really was a game changer for us in helping us understand how the building had changed over time. We also employed a paint analyst from Salem, Christine Thompson, who's worked at some of the most famous historic houses in the area, who's worked on the Lee Mansion before. And what she was doing, and you see her doing it there on the ladder, is from various parts of the building where paint still existed, pulling pieces off, examining it under a microscope, figuring out the layers, what the paint was made of, oil paint, paint with natural dyes from the 18th century, that type of thing. That's what she does for us. And she sort of helps us figure out how the decorations of the house of the building changed over time. And also on the bottom right, you see our dendrochronologist. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's the study of the tree rings of a piece of wood, a particular piece of wood. You have to be able to go from the bark, at least the layer of the bark, all the way through in your core sample. And the samples are tiny. They're maybe, what is that, the size of a quarter maybe? And he went throughout the building and he took these long but small diameter samples, brought them back to his lab under the microscope, and was able to sort of tell us, well, this section, these pieces of wood were from this period, and these pieces were from that period. And that helped Myron, along with the paint analysis, sort of figure out how some things had changed over time and informed our understanding of the building. It's really, it's so fascinating. And then, of course, there's the good old historian's trick of documentation, right? Looking in the record. All the way back to when the building wasn't even completed yet. What could we find in the written record about the building? So that's how we went about it. And like I said, it took a couple of years to really wrap our brains around this building because it had changed so much over the years. I say to people a lot of times when they come to the Lee Mansion, if Jeremiah Lee walked into the Lee Mansion today, he would recognize probably 80 to 90% of it. If Jeremiah Lee looked at the brick building today, I don't think he would recognize much of anything of it, honestly, which is unfortunate. We didn't know going into it that would be the case, but it wouldn't have changed anything because, still having that building and being able to tell the stories of that building is so important to us. And the last thing that I didn't touch on was the archaeology, which is happening again right now. So if you haven't stopped by the Mansion Garden, on weekdays, except tomorrow when it's raining, and June 19th, they're off for the holiday. But stop by between 9 and 2:30 and you can watch them in action, the archaeologists. So getting this building was really the impetus for the first ever archaeological dig that we had ever done on the site, which is kind of amazing to think of, having it since 1909. We had never been able to sort of get it together to have an archaeological investigation. And so the first thing they do is they come in with their ground penetrating radar and other radar systems, and they just make a grid throughout the entire property. And what you're seeing is some of the results of that on the left-hand picture. And that helps them spot anomalies, things that they want to examine further, whether they could be a well or a change in the soil structure that might hint at something. And then they come back with and dig test pits, which they did the first summer. And then from those test pits, they say, well, this is hinting at something I want to explore further. And that's what they're doing now. And that's what they did a couple summers ago. And currently, between all 3 summers of archaeological excavation, including what we have so far this year, we're up to about 35,000 artifacts, which I got to figure out where to store. It's an ongoing process, because not only do they have to dig them out of the ground, then they have to take them back to the lab, clean them, study them, figure out what this tiny little shard of ceramics actually is. And so it's an ongoing process, but it's already informed our understanding of the estate and how people may have moved along throughout the estate from one building to another, or where the outhouse was, the privy, or where the well was, things that we had no idea. Where was cobblestone and where was a workyard? So all these things we know now, including, how people moved between the mansion and the brick building. So let's really focus in now on the brick building. Have any of you ever heard of Ashley Bowen, the 18th century diarist here in town? I mean, he's a ship's rigger, but he writes a diary, and it survived, and it's an amazing resource. You can read it online. You just Google it. There's transcriptions online, and we own the originals in the museum. He's a ship's rigger who spends a lot of time working for Jeremiah Lee. And so when Lee starts to build his house and the brick building next door, Ashley Bowen is called upon to work on it, particularly to do what's called parceling, which is taking sailcloth and oiling it and making it waterproof, and then using it on the roof to help waterproof these buildings. It's something we see him doing a lot around Marblehead, actually. And one of the things he talks about in September and October of 1766, which you may or may not be able to read from where you are, is cutting and tarring parceling for Colonel Lee's brick house, he calls it. He also is referring in other parts of this to also doing the mansion house at the same time, but he's specifically talking about Lee's brick house. It's how he refers to it. He's spending all day doing this for multiple days. So we know that the building is under construction by the fall of 1766. But the first description really of what this brick house is comes from a deed, a land deed in 1767 in July, for a piece of property on the other side from the mansion, not anything to do with Lee. Lee's not even involved in the transaction, but like deeds even today, you write down something about the building so you can understand, or the property, I should say, it runs from this line to that line and that line to that line. And a lot of times back then they used existing buildings as a way to identify where their land purchase or sale was happening. And so this deed in particular speaks of this building as a, quote, new brick kitchen or coach house of Jeremiah Lee. So, okay, so we know we'll go back to the brick kitchen part, but coach house. Well, actually, of all the things that the building could be, it was actually very obviously a coach house. And I'll show you why. Because even today, after everything that's happened to the building, I do this, can you see it? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Or is that, okay. So walk by the building someday, you can really see the change over time along the side of the building that faces the Lee Mansion. So if you sort of cut the building in half, there's stuff you can't see off the left of this picture, but on the right of this picture, do you see these arches that sort of end in the windows? Well, these windows are much newer. These are 1888 windows that were installed then. But prior to that, if you continue this archway forward, it ends about here, and this one ends about here, give or take. And those were the arches that supported the carriage house door openings. And we know that Lee would have certainly could have used a carriage house because he owned in his 1775 inventory a chaise, an old chaise, a phaeton, and a sulky. And these are all not coaches the way we think of from, a Pride and Prejudice movie or something like that. Really enclosed, heavy, maybe 4 to 6 horses. That's a coach. Lee didn't own a coach, but he owned multiple small 1 and 2 seater, 2 to 4 wheeler carriages, if you will, along with the horses to go with it. An old horse, a moody horse, and 2 horses on top of all that. So 4 horses total. Well, the horses would have gone to the barn, which is around the other side. But the carriages, those smaller carriages, could have fit into through the openings that we still see to this day. So in a way, that's the easy part. Now let's get back to the brick kitchen part. In every other land deed from the 1760s through the 1800s, the early 1800s, when people refer to the brick building, they always call it Lee's brick kitchen or his new kitchen, but always a kitchen. And so I wanted to look further into this because, you probably have heard in the South, the idea of a detached kitchen is not unusual, especially amongst the larger buildings, what we would call maybe plantations and such. But, as somebody who's, studied a little bit about architectural history in New England, that wasn't something I was familiar with. And just to separate out in your minds, we're not talking about a bakehouse where you might bake ship's biscuits or bread. Martha Lee, in fact, owned a bakehouse that she inherited, but we trace that to a different site in town. So you may have heard in the past some people saying, well, this brick building next to the Lee Mansion was a bakehouse. But in fact, that doesn't seem to be the case. Those are 2 different things. So it's a kitchen space. Well, come to find out, now that everything's digitized and online, if you do a search for out kitchens or brick kitchens in the newspapers of Lee's time, from the mid-18th century even till the end of the 18th century, they actually do exist in the North. They're not as prevalent, but in the urban centers, so Boston, Philadelphia, Portsmouth, New York, I'm even going outside of New England, obviously, but let's just say New England, in Boston, in Salem, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, you will find people selling properties that include an out kitchen, either an out kitchen, unspecified kind, or as these specify in particular, and they're underlined as a brick kitchen. So why brick? Well, nothing else, it's fire protection, right, for your kitchen. Also, it's a sign of gentility. We don't see a lot of brick buildings in the colonial period in New England. Bricks were expensive. So even someone like Jeremiah Lee builds a house that's made to look like stone, and he builds an out kitchen made of brick. And there's a few others, in case you don't believe me. A large brick kitchen and chamber, meaning a room over the kitchen part, so a 2nd floor room. Isaac Ridley was another gentleman in Boston. This is 1775. I actually found his probate inventory, and it talks about what is in his kitchen. Here's just an out kitchen in 1759, and again in another document here. So they are definitely existing here. Again, amongst the wealthiest people in the urban areas. And don't forget, Marblehead was an urban area back then, a small, tight, wealthy area. So what's a kitchen? And what's particular? I mean, this is actually true for your interior kitchen in a middling class and your Lee detached kitchen. Kitchens are the center of domestic labor, right? And they're considered dirty workspaces. They're not the place where we spend thousands of dollars and we have our friends over and we have a cocktail in the kitchen. That's not happening. The Lees are not, the Jeremiah and Martha are not walking much into the kitchen, except maybe to tell them what they want for dinner that night. So the kitchen is a place of labor, but of domestic labor, cooking, baking, laundry, ironing. These are starting to get into the more dirty things, what you might consider dirtier, pickling, drying, preserving. If you are doing butchering, you're doing it outside the kitchen and then bringing it in to deal with the entirety of the animal that you're using. Dairying. And then if there was a kitchen garden, it would be outside the kitchen area where you might grow small plantings for yourself and your family. And what you're seeing here is the Royal House and Slave Quarters detached kitchen in Medford, Massachusetts, if you've never been. Because unfortunately, we don't have images of what it looked like inside the Lee kitchen. Oh, let me go back to one thing and say, but what we did find in the brick, because originally, thanks to the architectural historian, the paint analyst, et cetera, we believe that originally in Lee's time, it wasn't a finished building. There was no plaster on the walls. It was a 3-foot thick brick wall, right? Or three lengths of brick thick brick wall. And so if you were to build a hearth from that or a kitchen fireplace, you would build it out from the wall. And there's one image that shows a chimney on the building in the place where we also found below where that chimney was in the picture, in the photograph, you could see where a bunch of bricks had been cut away that were coming out, or I should point like this to you, like coming out of the wall. And of the size that actually matches very closely to the size of the kitchen fireplace inside the mansion. So we believe we did in fact find the spot where the kitchen fireplace originally was located. And once it wasn't necessary anymore, which we'll talk about, you know, how the use of the building changes, they get rid of it. They just cut it away. They don't need that anymore. It's taking up space that they can be using for something else. That happens later. And then the third thing about the building during Lee's time is that a variety of sources from the reminiscences that are written down and published in the mid to late 19th century, without fail, refer to it as Lee's slave quarters. In 1877, in the Boston Post, they talk about visiting the Lee Mansion and quote, "The sight of the slave quarters, which are still standing, has often brought sighs of regret." This is 1877, so it's, you know, a decade, 12 years after the end of the Civil War. And then Margaret, oh gosh, her name just escaped me. She used to write very often. She moved actually to Pepperell, which strangely is actually where I live now. But she moved out to Pepperell after growing up in Marblehead, Margaret Blood, and she wrote constantly back to the Marblehead Messenger saying, this is what it was like in Marblehead when I was a kid growing up, this, about that, about another thing. And one of the things she writes is, I wonder if it was generally known that the building, and they're specifically referring to this brick building, was the home of Colonel Jeremiah Lee's slaves. Samuel Rhodes refers to it as such. Hannah Tutt, one of the early executive secretaries of the Historical Society, refers to it as such. So it's like, it's constant. And so it's as if this memory of it survives in town into the mid-19th century, enough that people still view it or think of it as such. Even though by that time, it's been many other things, important things to the town. But I think if we think about the way memory works, it's not that surprising that people who either lived during that time or were the children or nieces and nephews of those who lived during that time, that they're still recalling that. And of course, as we talked about last time, for those who were here, but we do know for sure that Jeremiah Lee, in fact, enslaved individuals while he was living on that property from 1768 to his death in 1775. To show you, these are two tax records that he submitted for what he was claiming on his taxes for 1767 and 68 on the left, and 1769 and 70 on the right. And they both contain, quote, 2 Negro boys, 1 Negro girl. There's also his other tax records, which you see here. I just found some of these, so there's still preliminary findings, but basically the main number is how many enslaved people were in the town in the tax records, and what's in parentheses next to the date is how many Jeremiah Lee owned at that particular year. Or I should say enslaved in that particular year. And then on the left, you see from his probate inventory. When he dies in 1775, they take a listing of all his goods, his houses, his ships, his properties, his furniture, his books, his everything, his clothes. And there's 3 males listed amongst his property: Negro Jemmy, Negro Cupid, and Negro Diamond. So Lee is an enslaver, and he is enslaving during the time he lives on this property. So it certainly does make sense that one or more of those enslaved people could have lived in that brick building. Now, we don't know exactly what each of these individuals did or were made to do, and they probably served multiple functions in the household. Anything from a manservant to a coach driver, a carriage driver, to a gardener, to even a cook, which could be both a man or a woman at that time amongst the enslaved population. So that we don't know for sure what they were doing, but we know that they existed and that they were enslaved. They were treated as property. And going into that is sort of a whole other topic. So buying this building made the museum one of the three, at the time, actually one of two New England museums, historic sites that own detached slave quarters, because it is unusual in New England to have a detached slave quarter. If you had enslaved people, oftentimes they lived in the household, in the house, in the main house, in the big house. The other one is the Royal House, enslaved quarters in Medford. If you've never been, I highly recommend going to see that. And after we bought our building, the Shirley Eustace House identified what had been a stable for the Shirley Eustace estate, and they were able to purchase it just last year, I believe. It doesn't, again, it's changed a lot over time. It doesn't look like it did in the 18th century, but that was slave quarters for some of Governor Shirley's enslaved individuals. So now there's 3 in New England. So, you know, as we sort of do some of this research and learn more about how the buildings were used, it is possible we'll find others. But the idea of having survived, in fact, the idea of any outbuilding surviving in New England is unusual. So even decades ago, people from historic New England came and they said, "What, this building was built by Lee." Do you know how unusual it is to have an outbuilding?
Where is this one?
That's in Roxbury.
Thanks.
So it was important that we maintain that building, that we preserved it. So what did it look like originally? And we're going to go into why it looks so different in this little drawing than it does today. But originally, it was a much shorter building. It took up the same footprint and space that you see today, but again, much shorter. So on the left side, there's the doorway that would have led people out into the yard between the mansion and the brick building. A couple of windows that were probably original. You can still see a little bit of where all 3 of these things were on the building itself when you go to the building now. And here's those carriage house door openings that we saw the remnants of. We don't really know what the front of the building looked like at that point. What Myron sort of concluded based on what evidence he was finding is that there were no openings on that side of the building, which on the street side of the building, which would be here, which actually makes sense because you're not going to really have an opening here. If you get your carriage house doors there, those are your openings. You not necessarily need another opening onto the street per se. And then there's a little bit of change that happens in the late 18th century. We could tell that from the paint analysis, but we don't exactly know why. It was maybe after Lee had passed away and they were deciding they didn't need it as a coach house anymore, and maybe they were starting to rent it out to get some money because the estate was really struggling because the war had kicked into gear and his estate was insolvent. He owed more than he could pay back for his loans. So they might have filled in the carriage house doors at that time because we find evidence for some small windows there and then added windows and a door to the street facade here, and then maybe started to rent it out. We don't know exactly why or when that happened, but it's sort of a blip in time. Lee dies in 1775, his widow dies in 1791, and then both the mansion and the brick building start to go through a series of almost investors buying up the property, not really doing anything with it that we can tell, and then selling it on to somebody else until finally in 1804, the newly formed Marblehead Bank is looking for a home. Now, this is not the Marblehead Bank we know today. It's a different bank. But the Marblehead Bank is looking for a home. It's just chartered itself, incorporated itself, and they purchased the Lee Mansion. And what comes with the Lee Mansion is the brick building next door. And very quickly, it seems they start to rent it out as a store, like basically what we would call a West India goods store, that they called back then. But what we would probably call today, a bit of a everything store. Things that you could buy, not only foodstuffs, but other ceramics and other goods that you couldn't get elsewhere. And that is rented out by a man named William Haskell. And William Haskell actually in 1819 goes ahead and buys just that brick building. He wants that brick building for himself, so he buys it from the Marblehead Bank. And he takes up most of it with his West India goods store. But he also sublet, well, now he owns it, so he's not subletting, he's now renting out to the fire engine company in town called the Relief. So there's actually a fire engine being stored on site and the engine company renting a small space somewhere in this building. And actually, we believe that the fire engine was stored in this small shed that you see here. We don't know exactly when the shed was built. It doesn't appear on a map until 1850, but that it's already been built by then. And it actually stays up until about the 1960s. I mean, Bill Conley remembers it still standing. So it's not, it didn't come down that long ago. We're still trying to identify exactly when it came down. But it was likely there that the engine was kept. Now, William Haskell passes away in 1851 and his estate is unable, to keep the building. So they actually sell it back to the Marblehead Bank for $1. Likely Haskell still owed the bank some sort of mortgage for it. So they sell it back for $1. So it's back under the auspices of the bank, who also still owe the mansion. And the Relief fire engine gets to be so old and decrepit that they have to retire it. And instead they buy a new fire engine, the town does, and they call it the Mugford engine. And the Mugford engine now takes over the rental of a space in the brick building. And now the Mugford engine is what's being stored on the property. And after Haskell passed away and it goes back to the bank, they start to rent it out again. And they're starting to rent it out to different businesses in town. And one of the ones that's there the longest that we've identified in the 1860s to the late 1870s is T.T. Payne's Express. There's a picture of one of his carriages that we have in our collection there, and some advertisements from him that he placed in the local newspapers in 1862 in the middle and 1873 on the top right. And his job, his company, was basically making sure that whatever was produced here in Marblehead made its way to Boston for sale, most often shoes. So every day, the companies that were producing shoes in town could bring them to Payne, and he would ship them to Boston on the railroad station, which is now where the National Grand Bank is. And he stays there for quite a while until he moves his offices actually closer to National Grand Bank, which was a bad move because he moves in 1878 and there was a big fire there and it burned down about a year after he moved there, so. But back up for a second, even while Payne is still there in the building, Civil War breaks out. And they use the building as a recruiting office. And Samuel Rhodes actually talks about it in his history of the town. But the Peabody Essex Museum owns this document. And it lists all the, so here's the recruiting document on the right, and down the very bottom, it's a very big, well, whatever. You can see it, I put an arrow to it. It says Marblehead at Mugford Engine House. So you could go to the brick building to sign up to serve in the war. So we made it to about 1870 with the building looking approximately as it did as far as we can tell. In those earlier drawings that Myron did for us. But then photography starts to, become cheaper and easier, and we start to see more photos being produced in town. And all of a sudden we see a building that looks different than what Myron was showing us, the architectural historian, what it looked like in 1800 or so. And that's because it's grown. And so here's where the dendrochronology comes in. So the dendrochronologist went up into the attic and he wanted to see how old the roof timbers were. So he takes samples throughout the roof timbers and he comes back to us and he says, well, the roof timbers are from 1760s. Well, that can't be right because we can tell that there's an addition on the building. This whole section, and when you go look at the building, you can absolutely see the change in the brick. And you can even, although not so well on this green background, but you can even see in this picture from about the center of the second floor windows up, the brickwork is different. It's a different style, it's a different size brick, it's a different color brick, everything about the brick is different. And experts in brick, which yes, there are experts in brick, had told us that this brick is mid-19th century on this upper area. And so we're like, well, then how in the world can the roof structure be 1768? And what Myron figured out is they actually took the roof structure apart, put it aside, probably numbered everything, added about 5 feet of brick on top of the building, and then reassembled the roof structure on top. It's like Yankee frugality at its finest, right? So now all of a sudden, you still have a squat building, but it's taller. You have now, I think for the first time, a full second floor. And they take advantage of that. So this is the bank making this work happen, investing in this property, most likely so they can rent it for a higher rental charge. And one of their biggest renters is the town of Marblehead, because they're the ones paying for the Mugford fire engine to be housed on site, and for the guys who are part of the engine company to have their rooms, is what they call it, their rooms, up there on the second floor. So basically the bank's investing so they can charge the town more money. I throw this picture in because it's really hard to tell what we're looking at, but it's fabulous. It's one of the earliest photographs I've ever seen in Marblehead. It's probably right after that our building is added onto. And we can date it as before 1873 because these two buildings, we're looking down, this is our brick building right here. So you're looking, not quite from Abbott Hall, because of course that doesn't exist yet anyway. Looking down Washington Street towards Bank Square. Here's our brick building. The mansion's hidden by this chimney here in the foreground. But these two buildings burned down in a fire in September 1873. So that's how we can date that structure. And if you look very closely, I bet it's really hard to see here, but I can see it on my screen. And if you watch the recording afterwards, you might be able to see it. I can actually make out one of the arches. That's the carriage house door arches that is now, since they added this extra part, now it's going into a window. This is another great photograph from it. Also, I can date this one to 1873 in December. Well, it's unclear if it's September or December, but it's definitely 1873 because in 1873, a fire company from Pawtucket, Rhode Island called the Rough and Ready come to visit. They come to visit Marblehead and they spend time hanging out with the guys at the Mugford Engine Company. And if you look very closely, and again, this is very high res, so you can zoom in with the scan, that says Rough and Ready. And the sign says, we welcome our friends, the Rough and Ready Company. So again, we can date it to 1873. And this is the only picture from the front, looking at the front of this building, that you can see enough of it to see the chimney. And the chimney, I know it's hard to make out because the buildings actually come together at the back at an angle, but that chimney goes right down into where we found that hearth or the fireplace area cut away. And in fact, we could actually see in the roof structure where that chimney had been.
Lauren, the house next to, on the right.
Yes, yes.
Is that, do you know anything about when that was built or?
So this brick building to the right that Pat Lozier now owns, it was an investment firm for a little while and she's renovating it. This building was built about 1801, 1804. This, however, is a wooden structure that fit between those two buildings. And if you walk downtown, there is not a lot of room between those two buildings. And as I mentioned, the two buildings come together at a triangle almost in the back. So that building, I love this little building. I almost want to recreate it in some ways. It was a tiny little building, but it served many purposes. Cigars, tobacco, it became a lunchroom, an ice cream parlor, a barber shop. So again, it's like, where can we fit a building in Marblehead, right? In between two other buildings.
Everything comes back around.
Yeah, that's right. Accessory dwelling unit. No. Anyway, so this is just a close-up of the rough and ready. It's kind of neat. You can see a little bit of the front of our building. There was a double door there in the center. These two larger windows here on the first floor. They're covering up the windows on the second floor, so you can't actually make it out. And not only was the second floor the home to the Mugford Fire Engine, it also became known as Mugford Hall. And a bank would rent it out. In addition, when the Mugford Fire Company wasn't using parts of it, they would rent out to all sorts of community organizations in town. This is just a small sampling of the people that were there. A shoe cutters union was formed up in that building. A new cooperative bank was formed and met up in that building. A women's Christian temperance unit was up in that second floor of the building meeting. A boys prayer organization, you name it. Lots of different organizations meeting up there. So it really was a community locale. Now, once TT Payne leaves, the express company leaves the first floor, a couple people move in. Frank Brown's Provisions is there for a while. And this is a great photograph. So on the left is the Provisions. And on the right, there was actually a partition right here inside the building. You can see how there's two doors. So the left was the provision company and the right was a fruit company. And you can see some of the fruit in the picture. There's bananas, things I didn't realize we had in Marblehead in the 1870s, early 80s. There's all sorts of other things on display out here in front. It's really fabulous photograph of that. Do you see the
My
bananas?
grandfather had a store like that.
What's that?
My grandfather had a store like that.
Oh, they were
Sold
all
fruit,
over.
candy, yeah,
Yeah.
same thing.
It was shocking how many grocery and fruit and provisioning stores were in Marblehead. They were in every little nook and cranny all throughout the town. It's fabulous. And there's some interesting, the newspapers at that time, I guess in some ways are like the social media today. If something happened, it went in the paper. If somebody went visiting their cousin in, Poughkeepsie, it went in the paper. I think in some ways especially those of us who were around before social media, we'd be kind of shocked at how much of our lives would have gotten into the papers. We went to visit somebody, we got an A in school, we got a D in school, all the stuff shows up in the papers, but it's great for historians. So, some great stories come into the papers. There was a sudden drop in molasses at Frank Brown's provision store yesterday afternoon. A large 150-gallon hogshead was being put into the cellar when a post was cut through by the rope and the hogshead rolled into the cellar. The head of the hogshead was broken off and the cellar immediately flooded with liquid. We had our own little molasses flood at 157 Washington Street. Miss Jenny Smith was engaged as the bookkeeper at the provision store of Frank Brown in Bank Square. I mean, it's just great little snippets of the community that make it into these. Here's another view looking from Bank Square, looking up. You see where we are here, looking up Washington Street. There's the mansion. There's our building. There's the Frank Brown provision sign. That's where Rogers and Ware were. And as for Rogers and Ware, foreign and domestic fruits, canned goods and jellies, teas and coffees, cigars, tobacco, smoking articles. And then this story here. On Tuesday, Mr. Thomas Carroll, clerk at Rogers and Ware Fruit Store at Bank Square, had quite an exciting time hunting a tarantula. His spider ship managed to escape, greatly to Tom's chagrin. I assume it came in with some of the vegetable or fruits. Now I'm stuck over. So this brings us to 1888, 89. And actually sort of the biggest change to the building happens at this time. Still owned by the bank, the Marblehead Bank, which is now known as the Marblehead National Bank. Again, not the Marblehead Bank that exists today, nor Grand Bank for that matter, that exists today. But they're deciding to invest in the property, again, most likely so they can up the rents. And what they decide to do is raise the building 6 feet. Raise it from the ground up. To excavate the cellar while they're at it. Because probably at that point, now you can barely stand in it. Probably at that point, you could not even stand in it based on what we can tell from the cellar. And then remove that partition that I showed you on the first floor that separated right here. Remove that partition that separated these two stores to make one big store. And then install the plate glass storefront windows that exist today. Can you imagine lifting a brick building 6 feet in 1888? No. But they did it. They did it. They had a contractor. They found somebody from Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was what they did, is they raised and moved brick buildings. And they hired them. They did that. It took them months to do that. There's actually newspaper articles about, them getting the jacks into place to raise it, about the bricks being dropped off, because once you raise it, now you have a 6 feet open area you gotta fill in with bricks. They talk about the plate glass windows being installed, the interior being painted. It's just about ready for occupancy. This is early 1889 now. The interior work of Frank Brown's store in the old Mugford building is rapidly being brought to a finish. The workers are installing a patent ice chest so that he can have a big stock of meats. And now not only will he be doing provisioning, he'll be doing all sorts of various groceries. So Rogers and Ware, they're out. The fruit company is out. Frank Brown moves back into the entire store. So we go from this in the 1870s to that, which is now recognizable to us.
Lauren,
Yeah.
when you're facing,
Carriages were way on the left there?
That's that shed where the
Yeah, there. Is that where
engine
the
company, that's the engine company.
Yeah, is that where the carriages were though?
No, the carriages were where these arches were.
In there with the kitchen?
Yep,
Oh, okay.
sorry, Peyton.
when you're facing the front, the door on the right, was that door on the, yes, that door, was that added for the fruit company?
It's a different door altogether. It's in the same place the fruit company's door was.
Right.
But it's not the same door, because in fact, the whole thing was gutted and lifted.
But a door was added first for the fruit company?
Yeah. Well, at some point, yes, you can't really make it out there. Hold on. At some point, and we don't know exactly when, right, you have your sort of more main door. It was
Right.
actually a double door here in the middle. And this window here went for Frank Brown's. And then this window here and everything on the right, because there was an interior partition here, including this doorway.
Mhm.
Yeah, was part of the fruit store.
Hmm.
And the best we could tell is you actually had to walk into the fruit store to get upstairs.
So that's not the same door that we see today?
No, it's a completely different door, because actually this door, these doors and this window are now 6 feet higher.
Ah, yes.
And you can actually see the remnants of the windows. If you look closely at the building, you can see what's left of the windows, bricked in,
Wow,
because they had to add a whole other 6 feet underneath.
it's quite a Frankenstein building.
I always say to people, the actual original part is the cream in the Oreo cookie. It's right in the middle. Because you have 1870 above and 1888, 89 below. And so the Jeremiah Lee is now in the middle.
Did they just increase the depth of the cellar?
It increased the height of the first floor quite a bit. Because what you can't really tell unless you really zoom into this image in particular is it almost looks like you walked in
Yeah.
and you went down a step.
Mm.
Because when you really look closely at the image, there's right here is a keg, a barrel, and it's a little lower. So we wonder if, and they kind of decimated the evidence, but we wonder if you kind of went down a little bit and still didn't have that much headroom. Like it would have been close for me. So what that allowed them to do is have a much more modern store, big and bright They added a lot of windows that weren't there before. And we know at least by that point, they're installing gas lighting too. Did you have a question? No?
Oh, I did, but it's gone.
Oh, what do you think of it?
When you're talking about the original, it's not, it's a sandwich, but it's also.
And the roof, yes, thank you. Yeah, the roof on top, you're absolutely right, is also original as we talked about. So let me get back, so this is what we're at after all of that work is done. You can still see the carriage house doors opening. Actually, this picture, you can really see the difference in the brick from that 1870 edition.
Yeah.
That I tried to show you in the other picture, but you couldn't make it out.
So they must have changed the windows on the side too, on the original carriage house side. If they're raising it 6 feet.
Yeah, I didn't include it. There's one relatively decent image looking at the side of it from up near Abbott Hall area.
Yeah.
And you can see much smaller, much lower to the ground windows. So yeah, it's like a different building. Because now we have the same huge windows that you see along the side on the first floor.
And Lauren, what year is this photo?
So this is, we believe it's 92 or so.
Oh, wow. It looks recent.
Are the roads paved in any way? What is it?
Not yet. You can actually see there's some guttering of like cobblestones on either side, but it's sort of a hard packed dirt. So here's a before and after, which is not really, it's hard to compare them, but like before, our building matched almost in height these two buildings. You may have noticed that when the Rough and Ready company came, and now it's just huge in comparison. Which is again what you're seeing today. Here's the side windows now. They're huge 2/2, which is what you see today. So the windows that you see today, we had restored. They are the 1889 windows that were installed after the building was lifted. We restored them. And we unfortunately, they were so rotten up on the second floor, we had to reproduce them to match the 1889. Well, actually, I'm sorry, not to confuse everybody, because this is very confusing. These are the 1870 windows. Because when they added that 5 feet of brick on top, they were able to put these much bigger, nicer windows for the second floor. So all they did in 1888, 89 is lift them. And we still have some of the interior decoration from the 1870s. Again, that just got lifted up. It's still in the same place in the wall, it's just 6 feet higher. And Frank Brown moves back in. And now he has a lovely storefront and a brand new sign. And a little scary to our modern sensibilities, but a whole heck of a lot of chickens hanging in. I don't know how long they allowed them to hang there before, without refrigeration, but whatever. Frank Brown does go out of business eventually in the late, very, very late 1890s. And the bank still owns the building, so once he can't rent it anymore, they want to rent it to somebody else. So Albert Pierce comes in with a bake shop, and you can see his sign over the awning here. In 1899, he comes in, and just a few months later, he failed. But he was there for a little while. And it says in the article that he did some retrofitting to become a bakery. The front was going to be the store, and the rear he adapted to baking and put an oven in, which is kind of cool. There's no evidence of that anymore, unfortunately. And after he fails, an ice cream shop comes in. For at least a little while. 1901, the first floor, there's an ice cream shop, and it even says so on the map from 1901, ice cream. Meanwhile, upstairs, the Marblehead Historical Society, which is now the museum, which is us, had their first ever exhibit on the second floor of that building. I neglected to mention by this time, the Mugford's Fire Company, it's not really a fire company anymore. They've retired the engine, but it's still a benevolent association. And you may all know the Mugford building, where Pleasant Street hits Washington, where Mookie's at Mugford. That's the Mugford building they built. And they moved into that. And that became Mugford Hall, just to confuse everybody. And our building became Old Mugford Hall. Again, just to mess with your minds.
I was wondering about the fire association. So it wasn't a volunteer, they were actually professionals?
It was was volunteer, but their space was, and their equipment was paid for by the town.
It's probably very successful because right opposite there was the two buildings that burned down. It threw me earlier and it was just like you're a fire department, you can't shoot fire down straight opposite you.
I never thought of that. Right, when I showed you that
Friends
picture,
around.
when I showed you that picture and I said I can date it because those two buildings burned down, yeah, good point, good point, oh well. Maybe that's why they kind of went defunct, just kidding, but yeah, so this is actually a photograph of the Historical Society's 1901 exhibit. They electrified the building at that time in preparation for this exhibit, and you can actually, whoa. Sorry, throwing things. You can see an early electric light hanging there. And this decoration, we found evidence of, and we saved some of it. So if you come see us, when we open the building, you'll see some of that decoration still existing.
But by this time, they don't want to talk about slavery. It's the servants' quarters.
Right, which is a euphemism for slaves. Yeah, that, you see that even in the early 19th century sometimes. Yeah, oh yeah, because you see it in the news article.
Yeah.
Yeah, where they talk about that. You're absolutely right. But we know it's the same thing. So they're talking about slavery.
Do you have a time period when the last enslaved person would be there and then it might have become servant? Like, is there a demarcation line of when we think enslaved people weren't living there?
It's unclear. It's sometime between Jeremiah Lee's death in 1775 and Martha Lee's death in 1791, with the caveat that technically slavery is illegal by the court cases of Quock Walker and Elizabeth Freeman Moffat in 1783. Technically.
So somewhere in there.
Yeah. Of course, there's also other things going on with the Lees. They've lost all their money. They probably couldn't afford a servant. They probably couldn't afford an enslaved person anymore either, honestly, so to upkeep that person. So that's sort of its own story. But as far as the town is concerned, we don't have exact dates, but it would probably be around the 1880s, 1780s, sorry. So I'll make a long story short because we're running out of time, but basically the bank goes defunct in 1904, probably because the head cashier is caught embezzling $19,000 that they can never make up for. Yeah, and they start to liquidate their assets. So they start to prepare to sell the mansion and the brick building. And in 1909, the mansion goes up for auction. And again, very long story short, the Historical Society is able to buy it. And we've owned it ever since then, in 1909. But they try to sell, Edward Harrington, auctioneer, who sells the mansion, also tries to sell the brick building in. Doesn't seem to get any buyers. I don't know why. And it's not until 1914 that it's purchased. And at that time, it's purchased by local photographer Fred Lichman, which may be a name you're familiar with. And he starts to move into the building. You can see his sign here. Here's a better picture. Oops, let me move this on the top so you can see the sign. It's a great sign. Commercial photographer, Kodak's Films, developing printing. He's doing all of that in the building on the first floor. We have a couple of interior shots. The first interior shots of the building we have are during Lichman's time period. Here he is helping out a young lad with his film order. You can see the cameras lined up for sale over here. Fabulous photos. And I should point out the electrical running through, which by the way, we found in the wall still, side point. I don't know who this lovely looking lady is, but he's married to Cora Lee Mason Lichman, and they turned the second floor, Mugford Hall, into their apartment. They actually install a lowered ceiling. They leave the upper ceiling with all of its decoration from Mugford Hall there, which we've uncovered, but they lower the ceiling probably for heating purposes, because it was a huge ceiling. And they lowered it down, they changed the windows a bit to accommodate that, and this becomes their apartment. And before he moves into our building, but in 1912 or so, he gets an apprentice, if you will, named Fred Orn, who starts to work with him, who you see pictured here. This is actually a picture from 1912. We know that from the date on the calendar. Here he is setting type. And as Lichman dies with no heirs, he passes the shop, the building, everything on to Fred Orn. And Fred Orn maintains it. He lives to be, I think, 100, give or take. He passes it to his own son, Ray Orn. If anybody knew Ray. Oh, sorry, this is Fred here. This is Bad Osborne in front of the shop. It says here, but I can't see it, 1956. And there's Ray after a snowstorm in front of his shop. And when Ray passed away, that's when the family in 2020 decided to sell it. So in a nutshell, that's how the building, in a nutshell, for an hour, that's how the building has changed over time. And just very quickly, I want to respect your time, but I do want to tell you that the goal is, and we are so close, I've been promised by the end of this month, we will have an occupancy permit, that we will be able to get it back into the building. Our goal was to restore it to the look it had exactly after they finished the 1888-89 lifting and refinishing. We can't go back to the 18th century, it's impossible for many reasons. And we wouldn't want to do that as far as historic preservation is concerned. But we've restored all of the plate glass windows. I told you about the other windows already. The interior restored as much as possible, maintained as much as possible, but made it into a place that we could have our offices and archives on the second floor in a fully climate controlled facility. And on the first floor, we'll have an exhibit space, and I'll skip through this. And our first exhibit will be detailing the lives of the enslaved people that lived there, and always remembering not only them, but as we move forward in time, we'll recall the other stories of what took place in that building, because it is surprisingly a lot of Marblehead's history can be told just from sort of the changes over time in the use of this building. So I appreciate your time, and I am happy to take questions, but I understand if you need to go as well. Thank you.
With the archaeological digs going on now, are they looking for specific things, or is it just what they happen to?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of basing it on what they think they can find in the end, like the anomalies that they've seen. But in fact, like for instance, before we did any work on the brick structure, we had them do a very in-depth search, and they actually found Litchman's trash pit. I guess in the days before the dump, you threw even toxic chemicals into your backyard, and we found them all. So that's a really cool collection. But we would love to find Lee era things because we know so little about Lee because his documents are lost. We would love to find things from the enslaved individuals, but we have been finding everything from pre-Lee to the 19th century to Fred Litchman, and we will take it all because it all informs what we know about the area. Yeah, Peyton?
To what extent will we be able to experience in the kitchen building the day-to-day lives of the slaves and how they inhabited and used the building?
It's a great question. You know, we did have to buy the building somewhat sight unseen. We actually didn't see the inside, so we didn't know how much historic fabric, if you will, was still there, especially from the 18th century. And I will say it is unfortunate that a lot of that was gone, although we could reconstruct some of it through the bits and pieces we could find in the building. Also, we know a lot about what life for people who were enslaved were like back then, even in Marblehead, but also in general in New England. And so one of our goals is to recreate a portion of the exhibit space into a kitchen area and use some of the archaeological finds actually that we believe are connected to enslaved people to tell their stories, plus also the stories that we found in the documentation. There's an amazing number of stories of these individuals, and they show their humanity, and they show what you can do despite what's being done to you. And so our goal is to tell those stories, and also to integrate the brick building with the Lee Mansion experience. So it's all one. So when you go to visit the Lee Mansion, you will hear all about Jeremiah Lee and Martha and the kids, but you will also hear about how the enslaved people were there as well, and how maybe they experienced the space differently, whether you were a Lee family member or an enslaved person. What would that have been like? If that answers your question.
Are you getting any federal grant money, and is that changing?
Thank you. You threw me the law that I always forget to bring up. I'm terrible at selling ourselves. We did receive some federal funding in the beginning of the project from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was a planning grant that allowed us to work on the initial interpretation. We also received a Save America's Treasures grant from the National Park Service that worked on that was to help us preserve the building as much as possible and rehab it so it became a useful structure again. We were lucky enough to receive that funding. However, there has been other funding that has either no longer been made available to us, or we did not receive seemingly because of the subject matter that we were pursuing. So we didn't receive the second part of the NEH grant. And in fact, not many people received an NEH grant at all this year, unfortunately, even though the money was congressionally appropriated.
NEH, which is.
Oh, sorry, National Endowment for the Humanities.
Yes.
So, yeah, a lot of museums, I'll have a lot of colleagues and friends who have had grants rescinded. We did not have one rescinded per se. We just did not receive it, the second part of the first grant.
And what was the dollar value of that?
308,000. So we are fundraising. We will make it happen. The board is committed, the staff are committed. We will continue to tell the stories
What
and
is your-
incorporate them.
What is your fundraising goal, plus or minus the missing 300? Like, what are you targeting to
So-
raise for the next?
We think we can do what we wanted to do for 200,000. We just won't be able to have all the scholar advisors that would be part of this, that were part of it already. We won't be able to continue to pay them. We won't be using like an exhibit fabrication firm. We'll be using a local contractor and some volunteers that have generously offered their services. So we will be doing the same thing, and we hope it will be to the same level that we had hoped to do. We will just, we will make it work. Let's see. Sorry, I'll let you go first.
When you said that you didn't get a grant because of, probably because of the subject matter, you mean because it's about the slave?
Yes. Yes.
And then I had another question about, so what happened to Jeremiah Lee's documents?
Oh, if I only knew. We don't know. They're gone. And they've been gone for, oh gosh, let me see, at least 150 years, because one of his descendants in the mid-19th century already did not have access to them. So anything could have happened to them. It could have been to do with his activities against the crown and parliament, which would have been considered treasonous. It could have been to do with the fact that they may have gotten passed to his son, who then died in the 1780s, then maybe got passed to his son-in-law, who died in the 1790s, also impoverished. His papers are missing. I mean, it's sort of the vagaries of the archives, that some things survive and some things don't, and it's a crapshoot sometimes. Did you have a question before I?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if they're taking volunteers in the dig.
At this point, they are welcoming and asking you to please stop by and check out what's going on. And if they have, a way you can help out at that particular time, you are welcome to do that. But they love talking to people and showing you what they've found so far this year. So yeah, they're there, not tomorrow because of the rain, but any day that's nice weather, Monday through Friday, about 9 to 2:30, but not Juneteenth because that's a federal holiday.
So just on
Oh,
end.
sorry.
Go ahead.
You go ahead first, sorry.
Bob Booth is writing a book on 18th century merchants. And I don't know how far he has gotten with that book. And I know he's been working, I know Judy Anderson has been trying to raise money for him as well. And basically it's an age in Marblehead that we don't have a lot written on. And I know it's earlier in the 18th century. And as far as Lee went, he owned how many schooners, and he was trading vastly. It's amazing that we don't have better records on that somewhere, somehow.
Believe me, I have looked everywhere.
Yeah.
I've been here for maybe 9 years in a week, and I have looked in every repository I could find. It happens though, but you can glean from other people's records enough. I mean, I don't know if you were here a couple weeks ago for the talk I gave on the economics. I mean, we know a lot, but we know it from other people, or from someone like Ashley Bowen, or the probate records or something like that, but not from Lee's documentation. Yeah. Do you have a question?
So my last one for you is, after all the time you've been through this, what was the thing that surprised you the most from when you bought the building to what you've learned so far?
About the building in particular?
Yeah, for you personally.
I just can't get over the fact that in 1889, they lifted this thing, nice. A brick building with 3 widths or 3 wides full of brick all the way around with no, I assume maybe they had a steam engine jack of some variety. I don't honestly know. I know it happened because we know they moved buildings all the time. More so than they do now, although that one on Pleasant Street is like a recent move, right? With
Yeah.
the forward or whatever they did with it.
There's nothing in newspapers from them, like sale.
Yeah, they're all the time, but it's shocking to me that they have that, and that it didn't fall down around them, basically. But yeah, maybe that's not very exciting, but I
No,
think it's fascinating.
I was
that they
blown
did.
away, but you've gotten to see so many things over the time they've been doing this. That's great. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing.
I mean, also just the finding the stuff in the walls that just is still there 150 years later. It's just
Yeah, I know.